So I want to divide today's discussion into two parts. We are still going through the 13 principles of faith as enumerated by the Rambam. Again, this is the framework in which Torah can flourish. This is the architecture of what we believe. And we're up to principle number 4. We're going to cover principle number 4 today, which is the way it's described. It's a little bit complicated. We'll talk about it. But it's the concept of God being outside of time and space, and thus the creation of God and the existence of God being on a different level than everything that was created. And the creation of matter, of things, is ex nihilo, meaning that it wasn't around previously and God willed it into existence. Something out of nothing. At some point, you can't say in time because this is before time. Before the creation of the world, there was no time, there was no space, there was no matter, there was no energy. It was just God existing outside of those constraints. And bringing that into existence, what's called ex nihilo, what's called in Hebrew yesh me'ayin, something out of nothing. So that's the fourth principle. Again, this is the 13 principles of the Rambam. The first 5, but really the first 4 deal with theology. The 5th one is more about religion. I'll say, we'll talk about that next time. So that's the beginning of the talk. And the end of the talk, I want to begin discussing some of the conflicts that exist between science, or the accepted position of the scientists and the philosophers today, and Torah with respect to matters of theology. So we'll start talking about that, and that may extend into next time as well. So the 4th principle is written quite succinctly in the Rambam, and it's called, in one word, it's called kadmos, which means that God, the existence of God, is a necessarily primary existence, meaning that it preceded everything else that existed. All that exists other than Him is not primary in relationship to Him. He was an existence that had no beginning, has no end, is outside of the realms of time and space. And quotes a verse. There's many verses to attest to this idea. It's found in, for example, in Deuteronomy 33, God who precedes all existence. And that's the idea that God is an existence that preceded all, is outside of time and space, and brought everything else into existence, ex nihilo. Now there is an addendum that the Rambam added 20 years after he wrote the first edition of the commentary Mishnah, in which 13 principles is found. He added an addendum which says as follows, quote, "You should know that the most important principle of all of Moses' Torah, i.e. all of Torah, is that the world is a new world. Not world that existed forever, a world that came into existence new. That God brought into existence, God created after there was nothing in the world. There was only God." That's how he frames it in his later addendum. So there's a few different ways that this is couched. Again, we have this original comment and a subsequent comment, and there's different ways that it's presented in the other books that talk about it. But it seems like there's 2 separate ideas that are interrelated that are conveyed here in this 4th principle. Number 1, God is primary, has no beginning, is above the concept of time. Time itself is a creation. And everything else is not primary. Everything else was created by God. God effectuated, God brought into existence everything else and created that something out of nothing. Now, there is a work, a magisterial work called More Nevuchim, which in English is the Guide to the Perplexed, written by the Rambam, written in his unique style of Hebrew letters with Arabic words, and therefore it's translated from Arabic. But the original is actually Hebrew letters, transliterated Arabic. And he spends a great deal of time dissecting this idea, the 4th principle of the 13 principles of faith. In fact, section number 2 of the 13 of the Guide to the Perplexed, the first 30 chapters, the Rambam dwells on this subject. It was obviously something that was very important for him to discuss. And he explains the perspective of the philosophers, namely Aristotle and Plato. They argue that the world was eternal. The world was primary. The world existed forever. Turtles all the way down. And he explains their mistake, and he elaborates at great length. We're not going to cover it all. First of all, because I didn't read it all. Second of all, because the parts that I did read are very dense, and we will cover parts of it to explain this idea. But also, I would add that the reason why the Rambam spent so much time in it, because that was the central point of conflict that he had with the philosophers in his time. Today, even science, even the secular philosophers, they accept the concept that the world has a beginning. This is a major innovation that happened in the 1950s and 1960s when they discovered conclusively that the world has a beginning. And thus, 2,400 years of Greek philosophy that the Rambam spent so much time to try to disprove, and try to explain, and try to analyze, 30 chapters of Moreh Nevuchim, 30 chapters of God to Pledge, all that's not necessary today because really no one really argues this point. Everyone accepts this point. The first word of the Torah, Bereshis, in the beginning, is now universally accepted by all. Now I want to read how the Rambam phrases this concept in Moreh Nevuchim, in the guide, in section 2, chapter number 13. He says, the belief of everyone who believes in the Torah of Moses is that the world in its entirety, meaning everything that exists with the exception of God, God brought it into existence when there was nothing prior. And he himself, God himself, he is the one existence which is primary. There's no other existence besides for him, not an angel, not a galaxy, not an orbit, not anything that's inside a galaxy. None of that was in existence prior. And God brought all that into existence as he desired, something out of nothing. And then he adds, also time itself is a creation that was created beforehand, it didn't exist. It was created out of nothing. The concept of time did not exist prior. This is a very deep idea, which sounds very modern. It sounds like something Einstein would say, the idea of God, the idea of time being a creation and thus being manipulatable. So for example, the Mishnah tells us that there's 10 utterances that God used to create the world. If you actually count how many times in the Genesis narrative it says, Vayomer Elokim, and God said, let there be light, let there be this, let there be that, it's only 9. So how does the Mishnah say, how does the Mishnah contend that there's 10? And the answer is that the word Bereshis, in the beginning, is in itself one of the utterances. It's one of the 10 utterances. It's a creation. What is the creation of the word Bereshis? The answer is time. God created the concept of time in Genesis, in the creation of Genesis. We say every day, Baruch Yotzer Bereshis, which the Gaon of Vilna explains. It means it is a blessing of God that he created time. Now the Rambam elaborates on the intricacies of the positions of Plato and Aristotle and how they differed and how Torah differs. And it's interesting, he tells us that the first 3 principles that we've seen hitherto were agreed upon by Plato and Aristotle, but the 4th is where there is a departure between Torah and between the ancient Greek philosophers. And he explains that there's a difference between how Plato viewed it and how Aristotle viewed it. And I know these things don't really titillate modern audiences, but it is interesting. The Rambam does spend a lot of time talking about them, explaining why, how they differ from each other and how they differ from Torah. We'll just kind of go through it real quickly. So he says that Aristotle believed that just like God existed forever, the world existed forever. And therefore the world is primary. And therefore the 4th principle is a departure from Aristotle. We say that the world is not primary, only God is primary, and God brought the world into existence. That is the position of Aristotle. His teacher, of course, Plato, he believed that God is primary, but matter is also primary. and God took the matter and reformed it from the matter that was existing prior. Matter has been around forever. Matter is eternal, and God used matter that was existing eternally to create the world. And of course, the idea of the God of Aristotle, the God of Plato, these are very different concepts in general to the God that we talk about. We talk about the God that you could pray to, which is the fifth principle, that we're supposed to have a relationship with God. That's the objective. God cares about us. We matter to him, so to speak. He created the world for a purpose. All those ideas are absent from the God of Aristotle, but here's where the departure begins. This concept of God being the sole thing that existed eternally, the sole thing that's outside of time and space, and everything else, creation, was out of nothing, ex nihilo, that is a Jewish concept, a Torah concept, and not a concept that is agreed upon by the Greek philosophers. And the Rambam adds that the Greek philosophers, they use their reason. He goes on to explain how the reason is limited, because your reason is guided by your perspective. And your perspective is, again, one that comes after the world was created. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he adds that for the first 3 of the 13 principles, he does use some of the arguments of Aristotle and Plato, because they use logic to arrive at what we know from the Torah, but they use logic to arrive at, and that's okay. It's okay to use them for when they're saying the things that are correct. But the 4th principle is only deductible from reason. But the 4th principle is only deductible from tradition, and not from reason, and not from intellect, and therefore Plato and Aristotle, despite their tremendous gargantuan intellect, they could not arrive at it, because it's only something that can be deduced from tradition. It's not something you could prove by logic, even though that assertion is maybe a little bit contentious. So that's the idea. The idea the world is a new world. There was a beginning. There was an existence where it was just God. There was no time, there was no space, there was no matter, there was no world. And God, out of nothing, created that world and formed it in the way that we have today. It's interesting, the Ramban, Nachmanides, in the beginning of his commentary on Genesis, he tells us that there's 2 different words that the Torah uses to describe creation. One, the word bara, which means to create, and one, the word yatzar, which means to form. And the Ramban explains that the creation ex nihilo, something out of nothing, is the word bara, and the creation of something out of something else, of reformatting, repurposing something which already exists, is the word yatzar. And he adds, day 1 is the only time, and it seems like Rashi agrees with this, day 1 is the only time there is creation ex nihilo, something out of nothing. All the matter is created then, and the rest of the days it's not creation ex nihilo, it's reformatting, repurposing the existing matter of day 1 into the items that were created in the subsequent days of creation. Now, the problem with this principle for us is that we have to acknowledge an existence that we cannot fathom. That's beyond human comprehension. Because as creations, we cannot fathom the Creator. Moreover, the rigidity of the world in which we live in our viewpoint, post-creation, is fixed. And therefore, we cannot fathom what happened prior to creation. We cannot imagine a world where there's no time, there's no space, there's no matter. It's not something we could fathom. And that's by design. We were created and we were molded into a reality of post-creation, not pre-creation. And here we're dancing around the idea of the existence of God before creation. And the Rambam explains that all of Aristotle's problems stemmed from this. That he, of course, was using his intellect, but even his intellect that comes, that is considerable, that is potent, but even his intellect is limited to the reality of the post-creation world. And you cannot prove from post-creation the method in which creation came about. And the Rambam has a very beautiful analogy, very beautiful parable to explain this point. I want to read it to you here. He says, suppose you have a very wonderful and healthy person who's born, and a few months after he's born, his mother dies. So he's been weaned, and they decided to do an experiment with this person. Sounds like a little bit like the Truman Show. They decided to put him on an island, and he's totally isolated on the island. There's some males around him, there's no females around him. And they develop him and they teach him and he learns and he becomes a very advanced scholar, but never in his life did he see a woman. And even the animals on the island, there's only male animals on the island. There's no female animals on the island. Suppose you have such a person. This is the words of the Rambam in chapter number 17 of the second section of the Guide to the Perplexed. Now one day, this individual who's been stranded on the island his whole life, he asked the question, where do you come from? Where does man come from? Where does man come into existence? How was man born? How does man come into existence? So one of the people that are there tells him the answer. He says, well, there's another species of ours. There's the female version of ours. And she has a little pouch in her stomach. And the baby's put in there in this magical way. And for 9 months, the baby's inside the woman's stomach and is alive and is eating through this umbilical cord. And at a certain point in time, when they grow too big, then there's an opening that's opened in the bottom. And the child, this is words of the Rambam, the child gores his way out. And afterwards, everything changes. His eyes, which were closed, open, and his mouth, which closed, opens, and the umbilical connection gets sealed, and then he comes into existence. Suppose that person who never knew anything better, who never actually met a woman, who never saw this, who never fathomed this, someone who's very advanced scholastically, but he's given that story. Of course, it's rubbish, right? Of course, right? That child, that orphan, the way the Rambam calls it, he'll certainly ask the following question. He says, wait a minute. How does he eat? How does he drink in utero? How does he eat? How does he drink? How does he breathe? How does he go to the bathroom? How does that work? Well, he doesn't. It all works magically. Without a doubt, this person will rebut this matter. And he'll bring all kinds of proofs that it's not possible that this situation that you're describing is true. And he'll say, number one, if you stop breathing for even a few minutes, you'll die and you'll stop operating. How could you even fathom the idea that one of us, a regular human like us, is totally swallowed up in the womb of his mother for months and still live? It's not possible. That's the first question that this child would ask, this orphan will ask. And he says, another example, again, I'm just quoting the Rambam because the Rambam elaborates in this point. He says, if someone swallows a bird who's alive, is it possible for the bird to live inside his stomach? Of course not, it'll die. So certainly when it's in deep inside the mother, there's no way the child will live. There's no way, it's not possible. The child will definitely die. Moreover, if you don't have food, you don't have drink for a few days, you're going to die. Certainly not for months. There's no way this could possibly exist. It's not possible for us to eat and not go to the bathroom, and therefore someone who's in the mother's womb will definitely die that way. And if you make a puncture in someone's stomach, they'll die. So if you make a hole in the umbilical cord, they'll die as well. How is it possible they won't open their eyes? How is it possible that they're all crouched up there in fetal position? There's no way, and the Rambam says the person will continue asking question after question, and there's no way you could convince them that the creation of man was in that fashion. Because now, post-creation, the rules that govern humanity after we're born conflict with the methods in which we were born. That's the example, that's the analogy, that's the parable of the Rambam. And he says, this is something that you should dwell upon, you should ruminate on it, he's talking to the audience, he says, you should think about it. He says, this is precisely our situation with Aristotle. That we're following Moses, we're following Abraham, we know that how the world was created, They're, so to speak, guiding us, but we're blind because we've never seen the world being created. We can't imagine what the world was like when it was being created. And comes along Aristotle, and he's been living on this world by himself, and he's totally unaware of the methods of creation, and asks very logical questions. His questions are very logical. But the truth is, again, you cannot compare the realities of the world post-creation and use to extrapolate from that the means in which creation happened. It's a different reality. They're not comparable. That's the analogy of the Rambam. He says this is a winning argument. This is a winning argument because there's no answer to it, because again, we're trying to talk about a world that we have no connection to, we cannot relate to, and its rules not only differ, but conflict with the rules that govern our world. The Rambam adds, we said in that addendum that he wrote 20 years later, he said, this is the most important principle. Of all the principles, this is the most important principle, because without this, you really don't have Torah. If the world is eternal, if God is not the only thing which is eternal, if something else preceded creation, then you don't have Torah. Why? He says like this. According to the way that Aristotle saw the world, then nature is on par with God. The world and God are equals, because both of them are eternal. And therefore, God cannot manipulate nature. Nature is not subject to God. They're co-equals, so to speak. Both of them are eternal, and therefore both of them are inflexible. Both of them, neither of them is subject to the other one. And of course, that conflicts with all of Torah, because all the miracles that are the basis of Torah, all of that are examples of God manipulating and overseeing nature. If God has total dominion over nature, then Torah can have truth. Otherwise, it cannot. Similarly, says the Rambam, that without God having supremacy over nature, you don't have the destiny of Torah, the future that Torah paints for us. Moreover, you don't have reward and punishment. Because if God is not in control of us, if God does not have ultimate control, then he cannot really threaten us, so to speak, with reward and punishment. And therefore, the idea that we are subject to God only exists if this fourth principle of the 13 principles is indeed true. And then he adds, and again, this is 30 chapters of discussion of this subject, which, like we said, is a very arcane subject, not one that really resonates today, because the arguments of Aristotle and Plato are totally extinct. No one believes them anymore, because if you believe in Torah, you don't believe in them. And even if you don't believe in Torah, you also don't believe in them, because everyone agrees the world had a beginning. There was a point in time before time existed, and before matter existed, and before the world existed, before time and space existed. The Rambam adds that if you did not have this fourth principle, you would have all kinds of questions. For example, why did God afford prophecy to this person, not to that person, is a question that you would have if not for this principle. Why did God give his Torah to one nation and not to a different nation? Why did God command to do things in this time and not that time? Why did God command these mitzvos and warn about these transgressions? Why did God do these miracles with these prophets and not other ones? What is the objective of God via Torah? Why did God make Torah unnatural? Why do we have to resist the nature, so to speak, that's implanted within us? Why is there conflict? It shouldn't be easy. It should be a lot easier than it really is. Humans cannot understand the will of God because, again, that comes from a different realm that's beyond human comprehension. There's one answer to a myriad of questions. But once you don't accept that, once you assume that everything is within the bounds of what we understand, if you don't take this parable of we're on the island and there is a reality that we just cannot fathom, once you don't accept that, if you don't accept it like Aristotle, you have all kinds of questions, not only these questions, but many more. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, the concept of the Big Bang, which was theorized and essentially proven that the world is expanding, In the 1960s, they were able to prove that conclusively the world is expanding, which means the world is dynamic. If the world's dynamic, it's not static. If it's not static, it can't be around forever. And thus they extrapolated, how distant is the world and how fast is it expanding. And of course, what is beyond the world is something we can't fathom. It's like the same kind of question. What exists outside of time and space? It's, again, something that it's beyond human comprehension. Even the scientists acknowledge that. But today, everyone agrees the world has a beginning, and thus most of this principle is already accepted by all people who believe in Torah and people who don't believe in Torah alike. There was a beginning. There was creation ex nihilo. They may argue who was the creator, but there was the idea of time, matter, and space that came into existence at some point prior to which it did not exist. That is universally accepted, and thus this is really not, if the Rambam existed today, I would imagine, and he was writing his Guide to Perplex, he would not spend as much time on the fourth principle because it's accepted really by everyone that, or at least major parts of this fourth principle are accepted by all, that the world has a beginning, the first word of the Torah is true. I want to talk now about the intersection between Torah and specifically as it relates to theology and the accepted consensus of the scientists. I think there's a few ways to approach this subject. Maybe there's a cynical way to do it. Well, the scientists don't believe in Torah, and they have an agenda against Torah, and they're trying to disprove Torah, and they come up with all these cockamamie theories. The world's 15 billion years old. Go argue with them, right? Oh, we used to be monkeys, and we developed, and we matured, and we spontaneously evolved into being what we are today. There's a punctuated equilibrium, very fancy words, but it just happens. There's just changes in the genes, and it just happens. So I think there's a cynical way to look at it, and there's maybe a more subtle way to look at it. And I want to talk about these subjects as we are approaching the conclusion of the Rambam's lists of principles that relate to theology. I think it's appropriate for us to try to grapple with the questions that arise both from the scientific consensus and how it conflicts with Torah, and maybe the scientific hypotheses that are accepted, or at least are ubiquitous in the world and in textbooks, and see how they do, can they be reconciled with Torah? Can they coexist together? Are they in opposition? What do we know about this subject?